This is Steve Konigsberg, and I haven't much to say, but I'm glad I've found Baba, and I hope everyone else does. Jai Baba.
Hi, this is David Reddy. We're all glad we found Baba.
Do I turn this on or anything? Just speak right into it? No. I'm Helen Sanger, and I'm very happy to have the chance to thank.
The subject of miracles is quite important in a great many people's minds because they, for one reason or another, identify the spiritual status of an individual by his ability to perform the miraculous. I think that this is primarily due to our Christian background and association of the miraculous with Jesus Christ. But at any rate, Baba said no, he didn't perform miracles, and yet I will describe two incidents in my own personal time with Baba in India, in which there is no question that the miraculous was involved. And if you'll forgive me, then I do want to speculate just a little bit with you as to why I think there is this apparent contradiction in Baba's statement and his actions. So at any rate, let me go back into the history. In the earlier days, before Baba became rather fragile, when I would go to India, he would normally map out some odd days, usually about a week, of itinerary for me, various places that he wanted me to see, usually associated with trips in which he had gone around India with the Mandali, certain places where he had spent a considerable amount of time in seclusion. On one of these occasions, he had me go up to Panchgani, where the cave in the hill is, and to Mahabaleshwar, where he used to spend quite a good bit of time. This is up the mountainside from Satara, which he used just previous to the monsoon season, just as in the latter part of his life. He used Guru Prasad in Pune. He had, as I remember on that occasion, in addition to Dr. Duncan, whom we all know as Don, as I recall on that occasion, he had Francis Brabazon and Joseph Harb go with me. After a perfectly magnificent, lovely day, Dr. Duncan wanted to show me a herd of monkeys. So he took me down into a ravine and said, well, certainly we'll see the monkeys down here. We didn't. This rather upset Duncan, and as we were making our way out of the ravine, we got a little bit separated. He had warned me that there was a type of a poison nettle in the ravine, and that I should be extremely cautious not to handle it or let it brush against my skin. Well, as I was making my way up the ravine, suddenly I became aware of the fact that two of these darn things had crossed themselves on a very fluffy sweater that I was wearing. I couldn't go forward. I couldn't go backward. I was stuck, and the only thing that I could possibly do was, as gingerly as possible, remove these two poison nettle strands from my sweater. This I did, and only managed to touch them with my thumb and forefinger of my right hand, and assumed that with just that little tiny bit of touch, nothing would happen to me. Well, eventually we got on up to the top, and the following day got back to Mayor Azad. I then spent some odd days there, sleeping in the old blue bus, which was a wonderful bedroom. And, gosh, excuse me, I sort of got a little bit caught back in memories of sleeping in that thing. But at any rate, on the first day when Baba came into the Mandali Hall and asked for me to come in, he began describing something to me, and I noticed a little bit of itchiness around my fingers, but just very absent-mindedly. In the afternoon, when Baba came and sat down with the Mandali and again allowed me to be present, I noticed that my hand and part of my forearm was covered with this. Well, to try to brief the thing, within a period of 2, perhaps 3 days, I had quite an eruption of welts, which had spread over my right arm, onto my left arm, on my legs even. It was quite a rapid spreading. By that time, it was getting to be very difficult for me to concentrate on what Baba was saying at various different times. Suddenly, he looked at me and said, "Well, Don, what's the matter? What are you all scratching for?" Well, you know, when Baba asks you a question, you don't flub the dub, or at least you try not to. And here I was in a hell of a mess because I didn't want to tell him about Dr. Duncan's involvement in Stephen's itchiness. And yet I knew I had to say something straightforward. Well, within about 5 minutes, Baba had the entire story out of me. He was quite angry with Duncan. He told Arish that Arish should give me a certain type of a powder and see if that would cure it up overnight. The next morning, it was even worse. And of course, the very first thing after Baba had said, in fact, I think even before he said, "Well, how'd you sleep, Don? Have you gone to the toilet already? Was it successful?" And all of those things that Baba looked into so intimately each time. At any rate, he said, "Well, now, what has Arish's powder done for the nettle business?" Well, I said, "Absolutely nothing at all, Baba." Then Baba looked very thoughtful and went on saying something or another, and a few minutes later reached over to the little tabaret table at the side, picked up one of the clean folded handkerchiefs that was always there, wiped a little perspiration off of his brow, motioned to me. Well, I was absolutely delighted because although I'd been around Baba by that time, from time to time for several years, I'd never had one of these nice little plums of a Baba handkerchief given to me before. So I ran up just as fast as I could to his side and took it in my 2 hands, bowed over it, and then put it in my shirt pocket, thought no more of it. About half an hour later, I noticed to my amazement that I hadn't been scratching lately. And of course, with a particular training in science that I went through in the university, you stow these things in the back of your mind and your subconscious goes to work on them. When Baba finished off the afternoon, my mind quickly went back and said, "Well, Stevens, how are your nettles going on?" And while I could still see that this rash was terribly red, still a great deal of the sting seemed to have gone out of it. The following morning, 2/3 of it had disappeared. By the following morning, it was 100% disappeared. Now, one might say, well, it's coincidence. Actually, having been around Baba and seeing that there just is no such thing as coincidence around Baba, of course, I immediately connected this disappearance of this very troublesome mess with Baba's handkerchief that he had given to me. I thought a great deal about this over the years, but I'm going to tell you just one other quick story of Baba and the magnificent scene that we have of him sitting in his living room, accompanying arty records, mostly the poetry of Hafiz, accompanying this on Baba's drum. Meher and Mani had gotten after him, and they knew I always brought a 16-millimeter camera along, so each time I came, they would plot in their minds. I think I can use that word, and I hope Mani doesn't hit me with a rolling pin when she hears this sometime. But they would plot as to what they were going to try to wheedle Baba into letting me take in the way of motion pictures. Well, they were so successful over the course of several days that they finally decided that the big coup de grace of all that they would try to get Baba to do was to take up again, for the first time since he had been a young man, the drum that he had played in those days and get this down on 16-millimeter film, you know. This was the wildest thing and the most wonderful thing that they could imagine they could get Baba to do. Well, when Baba told me that he had agreed to do this, I saw a funny sort of a twinkle in his eye, and I thought, my gosh, there's thunderation and trouble involved here somewhere or another. What's he going to pull? And the next morning, Monty said, well, Don, now I hope that you've got a good sensitive film, because Baba's going to have the phonograph set up in the living room. No electricity there, incidentally, you know. This operated on batteries. And he's going to sit on the couch, and you're to sit directly in front of me. Well, as soon as Monty told me this, I knew we were in deep trouble. Because as you remember the living room at Meher Azad, there is one very large window that opens out underneath that wide overhang of the front porch. No light comes in there. And then there's a little tiny slit window that goes through this very thick wall out directly to the outside at the far end of the room. And the wall is so thick and the window is so small that no light comes in. So here was Baba. He pulled his trick. you know, and I could just see him chortling to himself as to what he was going to do to Meher and Monty and Don, who were so darn smart about all of this. So I told Monty, it's hopeless, Monty. There's not enough light in that room, and there's no way, of course, that we can lighten it up. No source of artificial illumination. It was before battery packs and things of that sort. And so I said, you just got to get Baba to move the scene of the crime to the outside so I can take him in daylight. Well, she disappeared for a half an hour, and I suppose there was probably a classic wheedle job that went on. But she came back looking very crestfallen and says, no, Baba says it simply must be in the living room. And so I said, well, I'll take my light meter in. The light meter didn't even budge. It was not only below the maximum opening that my camera could go to, but it didn't even budge off of 000. Problem number 2, the only film that I had left was film to be taken, used in artificial light. I'd forgotten to bring a filter, so even if we had been out in daylight, I suddenly realized all of the film that I would take under those circumstances would be bluish. So problem 2. Problem number 3 was Baba was absolutely insistent that in this narrow room I sit directly in front of him, and I could be no more than a distance of about 18 inches perhaps away from him. So even if there had been proper light in the room, it would have been out of focus because my camera wouldn't focus at that close a range. So Monty said, Don, for heaven's sake, take 2 or 3 reels of film anyway. Maybe you'll get just a little bit of something of Baba playing away on his drums. I said, well, I suppose I might as well, but Monty, it's hopeless. 3 major problems. I ground away, just feeling sick, because Baba was ecstatic. You know, he had this lovely, lovely, thoughtful, abstracted look on his face. And, you know, the more wonderful he was, the sicker at heart I got, thinking of all of these lovely films that we were missing of Baba. Well, to cut a long story short, when I finally left Meher Azad, I raced down to Bombay, got Codec to do a crash job, got them back, ran over with them to a little shop where I could look at them on an editor. And, of course, what I had to get at just as soon as I could were the films taken in Baba's living room of Baba whumping away on his drums. Well, you cannot imagine. I mean, the impossible. These are the most incredibly luminous, beautiful films that I've ever seen of Baba. Impossible. Absolutely impossible. And yet they turned out. I wondered, incidentally, 2-3 days later, when Baba finally let Monty and Meher wheedle him into taking the drum outside for a little bit of filming out there, why he was so uninterested in the whole thing. I mean, he'd do a little tap-tap, 1 or 2, and then start talking to somebody. His heart wasn't in it, and again, I was really almost mad at Baba for not cooperating. But here, 2 things that you and I would call the miraculous. And yet, why did Baba, you say, and I certainly ask myself many times, simply say that he didn't perform miracles? Well, I do believe that the thing clarifies if one goes back and reads some of the stories of Jesus Christ performing miracles that are given in the New Testament, and I think you'll be struck by what really hit me over the head when I did this, of the manner in which Jesus Christ never used a miracle except as a last resort of almost desperation to stir up a situation. And what have you and I and our ancestors done with this down through the course of the centuries? Instead of concentrating on what it was that Jesus Christ was trying to get at there, we're concentrating on turning wine into water and raising the dead and telling a woman out by a well about her secret love life, things of this sort, to stir them up to the point where they would listen and focus on Jesus Christ. So I think that because of the serious misuse to which the us's of this world have put the so-called miraculous in this reincarnation, Baba decided, well, we can't have any more of that booby trap involved in the Avatar's manifestation. Perhaps the one other thing that I should go into in some detail would be the 2 occasions in roughly the mid-60s when Baba involved me in the question of the drug problem with the young. I can't remember precisely the year or the occasion. Fortunately, I was able to be in and out of India quite a great deal in those days on business, and almost always Baba would allow me to come for a visit, whether brief or otherwise. On one of these, he said that a young fellow by the name of Dreyfus had just been there for one day, and Baba had allowed him to stay, I think, 2 nights and a day, and had talked to him at very great length concerning the use of drugs, primarily the so-called mind expanders, consciousness expanders, as some people choose to call them. Baba had Arish summarize at quite some length the comments that Baba had given to Bob Dreyfus at that time. Those are carefully recorded. They form the basis of much of the material in the little pamphlet called God in a Pill. And then he had me be sure to meet Bob Dreyfus, who was still staying with the Dada Chanjis in Bombay, and chat with him. There was a second occasion, quite some months later, when another young boy out of the clean blue sky hitchhiked in, and Baba was in very strict seclusion at that point, and at first he was going to send the boy away. And I'll tell you just a few things about what he said directly to the boy when he did allow him to come in for perhaps half an hour or so. But meanwhile, after the Dreyfus meeting in India, in San Francisco, in the Sufi organization, we found ourselves almost immersed in young people, many of whom, of course, because of simple statistics, had been involved or were involved still in one way or another with LSD, perhaps marijuana. LSD was probably the most frequently used at that time. On one of the interim visits, when I managed to get back to say hello to Baba, I said jokingly to him, well, you know, Baba, I think what I'm going to have to do in order to know what all these young kids are talking about and have some really practical experience to comment on to them, I guess I'm going to have an LSD experience. Well, you know, Baba has an absolutely superb sense of humor, and I expect him to chortle and chuckle and take it exactly as I intended it, but not at all. Baba reared back in absolute horror, and I'm sure he wanted to make a very strong point, not just for me. And he said, no, Don, not even once. You do not understand that while some people, and there's no way that they can know this, of course, but while some people can have a number of experiences with these drugs and apparently come out undamaged or relatively undamaged, another person simply taking a drug once suffers complete and permanent damage. He made a comparison to the manner in which these drugs work, something like a crowbar prying open a very sensitive door. He would never allow that to be published because I think there's some obvious dangers in the use of that particular analogy, but it certainly does give the instant idea of how very, very likely it is that, as it were, the sensitive doors of the mind might be irreparably damaged by